Thank you for joining the RIETI BBL webinar. I'm Fukuoka Noriyoshi, Consulting Fellow, RIETI and Principal Deputy Director, Trade Policy Bureau METI, and I will be serving as the moderator. Today, we are truly honored to welcome Mr. Matthew Goodman, Director of the Greenberg Center for the Geoeconomics. The title of today's presentation is the key characteristics of U.S. economic security policy. We will listen to his presentation for 20 minutes or so, and then ask Mr. Hirohide, Consulting Fellow, RIETI, and Special Advisor, former Vice Minister for International Affairs, METI, to give some comments and discussion with Mr. Goodman for 20 minutes. Mr. Goodman, please start your presentation first.
Well, thank you very much, Fukuoka-san, and Hirai-san, nice to see you again. I'm delighted to be with you this morning, your time. It's evening here in Washington, of course, and happy to have a chance to hear from you and your colleagues listening what you're interested in. I'll just give a few thoughts to introduce the subject, and then maybe we can have a back and forth discussion about this important topic of economic security. I think that my starting point is the question of the Biden administration's view of the world and how economic security fits into that worldview. And I think there are many things that I could talk about in this regard, but I want to refer you back to the speech that the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave at the Brookings Institution here in Washington in April of this year. It was a very important speech about international economic policy, and Mr. Sullivan essentially laid out what he called a new Washington consensus on international economic policy. He noted that the old economic order that the United States built after World War II and that we championed for many decades had come under strain and was, in a way, crumbling. There were many problems with this existing order. And he said, essentially with today's new challenges, we have to create a new order based on new assumptions. And so he questioned some of the existing institutions like the World Trade Organization. He questioned some of our specific policies like trade policy, and said that the Biden administration is going to do something quite different in the face of new challenges. And those new challenges included both domestic ones in the United States, that our economy was suffering from many dislocations and problems and underinvestment in certain areas like infrastructure and manufacturing, and that internationally we had new challengers like China and Russia and others that were undermining the existing order in various ways. And so he called for a new approach, and that approach included elements of what I think you are interested in talking about tonight, which are what in Japan is broadly called economic security. And I want to talk about that term in a second, but let me just say, I think in essence, the National Security Advisor, Mr. Sullivan, identified a number of risks and threats to the global economy and, frankly, to our nation more broadly, and to our partners like Japan, and said that we have to sort of protect ourselves against those risks, and we have to promote new capabilities including manufacturing capabilities and technological capabilities. We need to make supply chains more resilient and do a number of things to ensure a more, I think, more secure economic and national security position. And I say all this because I think this speech was very important, and I would recommend that you read it because it gives a very clear sense of Mr. Sullivan's view, but I think the broader Biden administration view, and maybe a view among many elites or policy people in Washington and the rest of the United States. And I specifically mention it because I think the definition of economic security here in the United States may be a little bit different from the one you use actively in Japan. As far as I know, we don't have a law, for example, on economic security. You do have a law that has economic security in the title. And when it's used here in America, I think it has a somewhat broader sense of ensuring that Americans are safe and prosperous, and that they're benefiting from the gains of economic growth and prosperity in a kind of inclusive and sustainable way. And I mentioned sustainability because a very, of course, clear emphasis of the Biden administration is on addressing climate change and promoting more sustainable or lasting growth. And I think they think of issues like that as being part of economic security. So in a way, I think it's first of all, not a term that is used quite as actively in the United States. It's occasionally you see it appear in some policy statements or legislative proposals or in academic research, but honestly, we don't use it here as actively. Or if we do, if you say it to an American, I think they think of something a little bit broader about their own economic stability and security, not just about protection against cybersecurity or ensuring that technologies don't get into the wrong hands and so forth. Although those are, of course, part of U.S. policy as well. So, but I guess against that backdrop, I would just say that the Biden administration has clearly been has been pursuing really, both defensive and offensive approaches to, again, what you call economic security. And I think that, and really, in a sense, it gets to what they call economic security, but specifically on the defensive side, sort of the protection side of the story, they have, as you know, used a number of tools of economic statecraft that are designed to protect us against various risks, and those include export controls, especially on sensitive technologies or critical technologies like advanced semiconductors, but also investment screening policies, both screening of inbound foreign investment into the United States to make sure it doesn't pose national security risks, and also outbound investment restrictions, although much less clearly defined, with less government intervention in that area. But that's a sort of new development here, outbound investment screening. There are also obviously a range of cybersecurity, cyber protection policies that are being pursued, and various things to essentially to ensure that our technological capability is protected. And you know about this approach of protecting technology in a very targeted, what they call a narrow targeted way, looking at a few key technologies, certainly advanced semiconductors, but also quantum computing, some forms of biotechnology or some biotechnologies, And they say that they are doing this in a very narrow, targeted way, and they're pursuing what they call a small yard and high fence approach, meaning they're just going to protect a limited number of technologies with very high walls and make sure that those are protected. But otherwise, they're going to allow technology to be developed freely and traded freely. That's what they say, and Jake Sullivan mentioned that term in his speech in April. So that's kind of their approach to the protection side. And then on the offensive side, on the promotion side of their economic security strategy, if you want to call it that, they're, of course, investing very heavily in U.S. domestic manufacturing capabilities, particularly in two areas: in advanced semiconductors, again, through the so-called CHIPS Act, which included, $52 billion of subsidies to the semiconductor industry here, and other means of supporting our advanced technology manufacturing capability. And then the other big industrial policy investment has been in clean energy solutions, and particularly in electric vehicles and other forms of more sustainable products. And in that case, they're spending as much as, I think the number is $369 billion. So whatever that is, san, sen, oku, doru, something like that. So that's the core of their sort of offensive approach of trying to promote greater strength of our economic and technological capability in order to provide a greater economic security. But they also, in the international space, they are promoting a number of other initiatives, including cooperation with allies and partners. Obviously, Japan is at the top of that list, on developing new technological capabilities. And so joint work, joint research and development efforts, and others on new technologies. So they're investing in a way in those promotion issues, as well as also undertaking a number of other efforts to try to promote our preferred economic outcomes. And here's where I think really another example where the U.S. approach to economic security is a little broader than Japan's, in the sense that I think the Biden administration sees certain initiatives like the Partnership on Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGII, which was announced by the G7 last year, as being a kind of economic security measure, in that we're trying to promote our, and when I say our, I mean U.S. and Japanese and allied approach to infrastructure investment, and to show our partner countries in the rest of Asia, in Africa and Latin America, that we have a better offering in that area than China, frankly, has. And then also in trade, or in broadly defined trade policy, I think they also think that things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the parallel initiative in Latin America, or in the Americas, called the Alliance for Prosperity and Economic Partnership, or something, or America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP, that those initiatives, IPEF and APEP, I think they see as part of an economic security strategy in the broadest sense of trying to promote our preferred standards and norms in kind of the new economy, including supply chain resilience and clean energy investment and better governance, like anti-corruption and so forth, which are all parts of IPEF and APEP. So I think they see all of that in the promotions of our economic security as being, part of extending our broadly defined economic security. So that's the approach that I think overall they're taking here. And again, a lot of this was laid out in Jake Sullivan's speech. My own assessment of this is that it's a fairly comprehensive and coherent policy, and I think it makes sense to have a combination of defensive and offensive measures on economic security. But obviously, I think there are some inconsistencies and tensions, as well as some gaps in the approach. And the inconsistencies and tensions include the fact that, on the one hand, they want to invest in domestic manufacturing of, for example, clean energy solutions like electric vehicles. But on the other hand, they want to work closely with allies and partners like Japan and Korea and Europe. And of course, as you know better than anyone, some allies and partners feel that some of these policies that are favoring American manufacturing are discriminatory or even protectionist against our even allies' interests. So there's a tension there, and there's maybe a tension and an inconsistency between the effort to invest in addressing climate change by investing in clean energy and buying clean energy solutions on the one hand, and on the other hand by being very tough on China and not doing more trade and even de-risking trade with China, which, China being a major producer of both the ingredients that go into some clean energy technology, like critical minerals. They process a lot of those, obviously, or the ultimate products like solar panels and so forth, which China, again, has a very strong position on. And if we restrict those things or try to move away from China as the cheapest producer of those things, it's going to have a cost, and that will include, not addressing climate change as robustly as the administration says it wants to. So there's some inconsistencies there, which they haven't fully resolved, the Biden administration. And then finally, I mentioned some gaps, and obviously, and maybe you've all heard me say this before, so it's not news, but I think the biggest gap in U.S. Economic, and I call it economic security policy, is the weakness of our affirmative offering of a trade policy to not only in the Indo-Pacific but in the rest of the world. The Biden administration is not interested in pursuing formal trade agreements, and that's a real problem, I think, in terms of U.S. interests, because those trade agreements advance our prosperity and our security, and they help create an alternative set of rules and norms to the ones that are being offered by China and others. So I think the fact that we're not pursuing those things aggressively is a real problem for U.S. interests, and we can talk more about that and CPTPP and everything. But and just this week, we've obviously seen the failure of, frankly, I think that's the right word, the failure of IPEF to deliver a final agreement or even a partial agreement on the trade pillar of IPEF, because the U.S. A couple of days ago decided to pull back its offerings and its ambition even in that first pillar. There was hope until a few days ago, or maybe till last week, there was hope that there would be a partial agreement on, I think, 6 of the 9 sub-issues under Pillar 1. And in fact, we got nothing in that pillar, and it's been delayed for the future. There was some more interesting stuff in Pillars 2, 3, and 4 on supply chains, on decarbonization and sustainable infrastructure, and on anti-corruption and tax. And those were more interesting, but still not the same thing as a formal trade agreement. So overall, this is, I think, a gap in our policy. And I'm spending time on this because I think it is a really important part of the economic security story. If we're really going to be secure, frankly, against China's competition and worse than competition, where they're trying to dominate certain industries or to steal certain technologies or impose their preferred digital rules on the rest of the world. I mean, that's a real threat to our national security as well as our economic security. So I think this has to be the failure of the U.S. to put forward an affirmative agenda on trade is really a weakness in our economic security strategy, in my view. Let me just say, I mean, I think next year, and this is the last thing I'll say about this topic, but if you want, I can also say a word or two about maybe during the question and answer, Hirai-san, we can talk about the Biden-Xi meeting, and maybe about, well, actually, let me just say one more thing that closes out my assessment of U.S. economic security policy, which is that just yesterday, or maybe the day before, Tuesday, the United States and Japan held the 2+2 economic dialogue with the Gaimusho and METI plus State Department and Commerce Department. And they produced about a 4-page, 5-page document, which I have here, 16 paragraphs, on a joint statement on cooperation between the U.S. and Japan. Nothing really new in there, but an affirmation of some of the points that I've been talking about. For example, or it's really a reinforcement of the points that were in the G7 declaration about economic security, and it covers non-market policies, it covers economic coercion, resilient supply chains, protecting and promoting critical technologies, export controls, critical minerals. Those are all topics that are discussed in this joint statement. And although there's no really new breakthroughs on any of those issues, I think it's very significant the U.S. and Japan have once again made a clear statement of this sort of shared agenda in the broadly defined economic security area. So I'd recommend you take a look at that because it has a lot of interesting points in it. Anyway, just finally about the outlook for next year. I mean, next year is an election year here in the United States, and a little bit under 1 year from today, we will have our presidential and congressional elections. And, I'm not going to predict how those are going to come out because that's a fool's game to try to predict 1 year ahead. I think it's still very open, and the result is probably going to be very close. That's the best I can say. But I think two things I can say about that in this context of economic security. I would say on the one hand, there will be a continued focus on many of the issues that are on the economic security agenda next year. I think, again, notwithstanding any new stabilization of U.S. China relations or a positive meeting between President Biden and President Xi, I think the basic fundamental tensions and competition and differences in the U.S. China relationship will be very strong. The U.S. political debate about China will continue to be very noisy and very sort of confrontational towards China. And so in that context, plus the underlying concerns the Biden administration has, I think means that in 2024, you'll have a still very robust and strong set of policies on export controls, on investment screening, on all of the things we've done, making supply chains more resilient and diversifying. And I think that's going to continue. On the other hand, I think any developments on the more affirmative, offensive side of the policies that I've been talking about are going to be very limited in 2024. Both domestic industrial policy is going to be very constrained because I think the Biden administration will not be able to get many more or anything done in Congress that adds new investments or spending. And even executive action is going to be very difficult. And then certainly on trade or anything like that, the Biden administration is going to be very reluctant to agree or move forward any really positive agenda. I mean, if we could not agree to a Pillar 1 trade deal in IPEF in 2023, I can't imagine it's going to be easier to reach such a deal in 2024 with the election looming. And then after the second thing or final thing I'll say is, after the election, and again, I'm not predicting how it's going to come out. I would just say that, whatever happens in the election, I think you will still see the U.S. taking a very strong stand on China-related risks. And there will still be a number of very forceful policies. They might be a little bit different policies. If Trump wins, they may be more focused on trade and tariffs. If Biden wins, or frankly anybody else like Nikki Haley or somebody wins, then I think you'll see maybe a little more focus or continued focus on the technology issues versus the trade and tariffs. And then I think that you'll still have constraints on our trade policy in a new administration. Although, again, if one of the other Republican candidates, for example, Nikki Haley is the former governor of South Carolina and UN ambassador under Trump, she's gaining some attention now. She's very far behind Trump, so the chances are not great today that she's going to win. But if she wins, that would imply maybe a breakthrough of a more traditional Republican perspective in that party, and that could mean a return to something more like a traditional trade policy. But this is far too speculative at this point, and I think it's not really worth speculating too much on that. But I think that's probably enough, and I've gone over time anyway. So I'm happy to talk to you, Hirai-san, and then to your audience if they have questions.